Today we're going to be looking at probably the most dangerous species in the Halo universe, the Flood. We'll be looking at their various forms, how they came to be, and some very bizarre decisions by humans that led to their uprising along the way. Welcome to Digital Bestiary, the channel that covers the most interesting lore in the video game multiverse. If that's something you're into, consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing for more. So this story actually starts 10 million years before the games take place. To save time, we'll use BCE, or Before Common Era, for time frames. So 10 million BCE, there was a godlike race called Precursors. Essentially, these were shape-shifting beings that lived throughout the cosmos and had the ability to accelerate evolution. And they created the Mantle, they called it, which is essentially a role in the universe to oversee the safety and development of all other life in the galaxies. During this time, the Precursors created numerous intelligent species which developed and flourished, including the forerunners and the humans. The forerunners were an extremely advanced race but have since been extinct. However, in-game, you can come across and even engage in combat with much of their technology that still remains across the galaxy. The Precursors planned on passing the mantle of responsibility to another species once their time was over. They ultimately decided on humanity to be their successor and deemed the forerunners as unworthy. This decision did not go well with the forerunners. They saw themselves as the next race to take the mantle, as they were extremely technologically advanced compared to all the other races. So they decided to stage a massive rebellion against the Precursors in an attempt to wipe them out entirely. The Forerunners were mostly successful as the war went on until only a few Precursors remained. The last of the Precursors vowed that none of their creations would ever rise against them again, and in doing so, a few of them literally transformed into dust, which at a later time was meant to regenerate into their previous forms. This didn't quite go as planned though, because the dust became corrupted and started creating sickness, insanity, and mutations in other species it came into contact with. This would be known as the very earliest stages of the Flood. The last remaining Precursor, however, was contained in a capsule and placed on a ravenous planet in the outer galaxy around 9 million BCE by the Forerunners. This Precursor would be known as the Primordial, and would reveal the origin of the Flood to anyone searching for the truth. But what did the Forerunners do with this cosmic dust, the first stages of the Flood, that was left just floating around in space? Well, the Forerunners are known to catalog and preserve everything they can, so they put the dust into millions of glass containers and stored them on automated starships away from inhabited planets where they thought they would be left alone for good. But as time will tell, they were definitely wrong. For over millions of years, the dust in the ships had slowly been deteriorating. So much so that the ships ultimately failed, and eventually many of them would be found crash-landed on various planets throughout the galaxy. The first contact with this dust was in the year 107,455 BCE by ancient humans. And no, ancient humans are not cavemen like we think of. They are just ancient in the time frame of the Halo universe. Ancient humans were actually already very technologically advanced and had already colonized multiple planets. These ancient humans discovered these containers of dust in crashed ships on many planets, both deserted and inhabited. They thought it would be a good idea to do some scientific testing on the material, in which they discovered it consists of short-chain molecules of unknown purpose. There was very little they could figure out about this dust. They ultimately deemed it harmless, which in hindsight was a huge mistake. With millions of these containers throughout the galaxy, the ancient humans wanted to find a use or a purpose for this new dust, but they also wanted to do some further testing as well. So the next step, they figured they would try feeding it to some of their pets. So at the time, a species known as Faru were a very common domesticated animal for both humans and the San Shum, a race widely known as the Prophets. There isn't a lot of descriptors for these animals, only that the Faru were small, gentle herbivores. The humans decided to try and feed the dust to their Faru, and they noticed that it would have some psychotropic effects on them, and actually enhanced the Faru, causing them to be more charismatic, as they put it, and better domesticated pets. This actually created a high demand for these special pets on the black market. But little did the humans know, there were more changes taking place in their pets than they thought. The dust itself was very slowly attaching itself to more parts of their body and changing other aspects of their genome. This was so slow, however, that nobody really noticed anything for several centuries. Giving the Faru this dust had gone on for literal hundreds of years. But at this point, the Faru who consumed it were starting to develop some very disturbing changes. Little furry growths and fleshy protrusions started to appear on the outside of their bodies. They noticed other Faru would also start eating at these growths, and sometimes eating the animals themselves, which is very odd considering the animals were natural herbivores. They also started becoming infertile in some cases and developing all kinds of genetic deformities over time. This caused many of these small animals to either be released into the wild or straight up euthanized. The bigger problem with all this is that not all the humans and the Sanshum considered Faru as pets. It was also common to consume these animals as a delicacy. So it wasn't long before the infection made its way to humans. The infection starts on a psychological level, causing the infected humans to seek out and consume infected Faru, or really any other infected tissue for that matter. The infection was soon passing through touch as well, even if the host was no longer alive. Limbs and other parts of the infected body would fall off and then would become a vector to spread this infection. All these variables combined were a nightmare for both humans and the Sanshum. It allowed the infection to spread rapidly through multiple methods. Unable to contain the spread through failed quarantine attempts from both humans and the Sanshum, the infection made its way through hundreds of planets in 15 systems. At this point, the infection mutated from mostly mind-altering effects to also morphing its victims into various forms. The first notable form was the basic combat form. Essentially, this was a combination of host and flood. The host no longer had any more control, but you could still see various limbs protruding from the mass of the flood. Then there were infection forms like tadpoles, pods, and cedars. They were essentially used to spread the infection and gather new hosts. Carrier forms were used to incubate, transport, and spread the lesser infection forms I just mentioned. The basic carrier would incubate pod infectors, bloating up and releasing them upon their death. The spawner will instead quickly find a viable placement and then remain stationary to continuously release pod infectors. The bursters, on the other hand, essentially serve the same purpose as the basic carriers, except they would burrow underground and emerge above to release the pods. Next are the pure flood forms. Depending on the task at hand and the biomass available to them, different versions would be created and formed. There's stalkers, which would specialize in stealth until they deemed it necessary to transform into one of the other forms. Tanks, which had very high strength and endurance. Ranged flood, who would remain stationary mostly on walls and ceilings and fire very sharp projectiles at their targets. And also infestors, which would specifically target vehicles, breaking inside to infect any passengers. They would also target other enemies if no vehicles were nearby. Then finally, the key minds, nodes of the flood's collective consciousness. They had a little more intelligence and had control over other flood, and they were leaders and commanders of the flood army. This included juggernauts, which were 18 feet tall behemoths with immense strength, capable of impaling vehicles with their large tentacles. Then the abominations, which are actually an evolved form of the juggernaut. It isn't as deadly as the juggernaut on its own, but it was much more efficient at commanding lesser forms of flood, making the surrounding flood more durable and lethal towards the enemy. The last two are the proto-gravemind, which when given enough time would grow and form into the full gravemind, the ultimate form and the center of the intelligence for the hive mind. If the flood can be considered an entity of its own, the gravemind is the brain. capable of speech and higher level intelligence, commanding the entirety of the army. Humans were weakened by the rapid spread of the Flood army, and in a desperate act began destroying any Forerunner ships containing this dust in an attempt to sanitize any sign of the Flood. The Forerunners, however, being unaware of the Flood or its capabilities, saw this as an act of war from the humans. These ancient humans now faced a long war against Flood and Forerunners both. Now that you know the origins of the Flood, let me know if you want a sequel for the events that take place after. Let me know down below in the comments. And I hope you guys enjoyed this story of how the Flood came to be. If you did, consider leaving a like on the video and subscribing for more. I will catch you guys in the next one, and as always, good luck and have fun.